Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to outline a synthesis essay. So these tips can be applied to exam practice or to a longer assignment for class. It might seem really obvious, but the first step is going to be to read the prompt because the College Board does a great job of offering a little bit of context for the issue. They also define terms that might be a little bit unfamiliar to students. So you need to take time to read the background info, not just the task itself. The task itself is going to be phrased as a statement, and I found that when students actually take that statement and turn it into a question, it helps them focus on what they're supposed to be addressing in their essay. It's also really helpful to assert a position before you actually approach the sources. Now, keep in mind that this is just a tentative position. You can change your mind, you can add to it, things like that, but it is helpful to kind of take a stance before you actually approach the sources because that will help you have a little bit of direction as you are trying to figure out what your argument actually is. The next step is to annotate the sources. So in class, when I'm going over a synthesis essay with my students, we typically annotate each of the sources and take our time. That being said, for the exam, students often want to know, do I have to annotate all the sources? And the answer is no, because quite frankly, if it's a source that you don't understand or you know you're not going to use, you're just wasting your time if you try to annotate it. Another tip would be that if there is a visual text pretty early on, especially if it's like a cartoon or a photograph, if it's like source A or source B, you might want to just skip that and come back to it because sometimes it's really difficult to understand the significance of a visual text if you haven't read the other sources. So one thing you're going to want to do as you annotate is you're going to want to come up with a system that works for you. Keep in mind that on the AP exam, you're not allowed to have highlighters. I know a lot of students like to color code, I do too, but you need to come up with a different system. So it could be underlining or circling things, putting a star by something that's really important. It could also be bullet points. I ask my students to do bullet points with commentary verbs or power verbs, things like demonstrates, illustrates, suggests, because that helps them figure out how they could actually use the source in their essay. So as much as I love to underline certain things and put stars next to certain things, sometimes that can really kind of cloud up the resource and then suddenly you can't figure out why you underlined it in the first place. So bullet points in the margin or underneath the resource can be a great way to do it. Usually there's plenty of space on the page for you to annotate effectively. Now let's talk about actually outlining an essay. So the first thing you're going to do is think about your introductory paragraph. And I like to break this down into two parts, the context and the thesis. So the context can be a little bit tricky for students at times, but basically the idea is to situate the issue in a broader context. So what background information do you know about this topic? Why are people talking about this issue? Things like that. That can help you lead into your actual thesis. That's where you're going to be asserting your position. Now, as you're writing your context, you don't want to have generalizations. A lot of times it's really tempting to say, the issue of blank has been debated for years. And while that might be true, that's a really vague lead in because quite frankly, I could put a bunch of things in that blank and the sentence really wouldn't change. So you want to give specific context, not generalizations. Now for your thesis, you need to assert a clear position. And there's different levels of a defensible thesis. All of them earn the thesis point as long as they're defensible, but quite frankly, there are some mediocre thesis statements, there are good thesis statements, and then there are great thesis statements. And I actually talk about this in a couple of my other videos, so I will link that above there in the iCards. But one thing to keep in mind is that you need to assert a clear position that you can prove in your essay. Now let's talk about planning your body paragraphs, because quite frankly, the bulk of your score for a synthesis essay is going to come from your body paragraphs. So one of the things you have to ask yourself is, how many paragraphs do I intend to write? Most students typically write either 2 or 3 body paragraphs, especially for a timed synthesis essay. But it's good to know how many you intend to write from the get-go, simply because you need to figure out how to pace yourself. Because obviously, if you're writing 3 body paragraphs, you're going to need to pace yourself more quickly than if you're writing 2 body paragraphs. The key, though, is not necessarily the number of body paragraphs, but the development of those paragraphs. And that comes from your evidence and commentary. So what I tell my students to do is to ask themselves, what is the main idea of this body paragraph? Because remember, you need a line of reasoning. So your ideas or your paragraphs need to be in a logical order. So think about the main idea, note that down in your outline somewhere, and then think about which evidence is going to help you prove this claim. So each body paragraph has to have a purpose. It has to have a function within your argument. And so you're making a claim in that body paragraph. You need to find evidence from usually a couple different sources that you can weave into that paragraph. So sometimes students ask, if I write 3 body paragraphs, does that mean I need 1 source per paragraph? And quite frankly, usually it reads better if you cite 2 different sources in the same paragraph, because then you're starting to put those sources into a conversation with each other. So they could be sources that are related, maybe they're on a similar topic or they have a similar argument, or they could be contrasted and you could use one as a counterclaim and rebuttal perhaps. So choose your evidence. In an outline, I like for students to kind of do like a quick little blurb. Maybe they pull a quote or something, a short quote as their evidence, and then do a bullet point or 2 of commentary. You also need to remember that you need to cite 3 different sources in your synthesis essay. So I like for students to include the citation of the source with their evidence in the outline. That way they know exactly which source it came from. Another thing to consider when you're planning your body paragraphs is, do you intend to have a concession and refutation or counterclaim and rebuttal? And if so, where is that going to go? Is it going to be in the first body paragraph or your last body paragraph? Is it going to be its own separate body paragraph, or is it going to be worked into an existing body paragraph? You need to make that decision as well. So I'm going to be perfectly honest, when it comes to conclusions, I sort of have mixed feelings about whether or not I actually want my students to include that in their outline. And it kind of depends on the assignment. So if they're doing a full outline and they have class time to work on it, or it's for homework, then I do expect them to actually include some bullet point notes about the conclusion. So what I would be looking for in this case would be something like restating their thesis, but not verbatim, so not word for word, and also trying to connect to a broader context. But if it's a timed writing situation, let's say they only have 15 minutes to read the sources and annotate and plan like they would on the exam, then I would not expect any of my students to actually include the conclusion paragraph in their outline, because quite frankly, I think their time could be better spent either planning other elements of their essay or simply writing the essay in general. So you do need to think about a conclusion, and hopefully you're able to pace to actually write a conclusion. But I would not necessarily include this in your notes if you're trying to do a timed outline. Okay, so this is just a sample to show you guys some of the skills we talked about in the video. So you'll see here that I have some sample annotations. When I have my students do digital annotations, I usually have them make a chart. Sometimes the chart is a bit more detailed than this, but the idea is to annotate the different sources and just compile some bullet points of observations of that source and things like that. And this is a good way to help you kind of visualize how the different sources might relate to each other so that you can start to put those sources in conversation with each other. So you're looking for different sources that might talk about the same issue, or that they might have contrasting perspectives on that issue. So this is just a sample of the table. Obviously, with a real synthesis essay, there would be 6 to 8 sources, so you'd have more annotations there for the other sources. So something else we talked about was the context. And so this can be a way to lead into your thesis, trying to situate the issue in a broader context. So what I like to do is just jot down some notes. So for instance, with the wind farms prompt, I realized that there are finite resources like coal and oil. And with oil specifically, we have a dependence on foreign countries in some instances. So that could be a way to lead into this idea that we need a clean, renewable energy source. So just a way to kind of take whatever existing background knowledge you have and using that as a way to segue into your thesis. As far as thesis statements go, my students have told me it's helpful to write a thesis statement in advance as they're planning their essay, because it gives them direction as they're trying to outline. So a lot of times if it's a timed essay, my students don't necessarily write a complete sentence, they just kind of jot down some thoughts. But some of them have said that they actually take the time to write a complete sentence because they can just rewrite it in their essay, and it helps them feel like they have some direction for what they're writing. So this top example here is more of a simple thesis. It does assert a position, but it's not very detailed, just kind of a quick thesis statement to assert a position, but again, not very in-depth. Now, this second example obviously would take a little bit more time to write. You could probably shorthand this a little bit if you're trying to do some notes. But this one is a counter-argument thesis, so it's a little bit more sophisticated. So sometimes what I have students do is they write it both ways, and they might use one in their intro and they might restate it differently in their conclusion. So it can be helpful to write your thesis down as part of your outline, because remember, your evidence and commentary have to prove your thesis. So you want to have a strong thesis that you're actually trying to prove throughout your essay. So I tell students to include that in their outline if it's an outside of class assignment, and then if it's a timed writing assignment for in class, I still want them to figure out what their position is. So now let's look at body paragraphs. As I said earlier in the video, it can be really helpful to figure out if you want to do 2 or 3 body paragraphs before you actually start writing. This can help with your pacing, and it can also help you figure out the progression of your ideas, basically your line of reasoning. So one thing that I recommend you do is figure out how many body paragraphs you want, and then figure out the main idea of each of those paragraphs, because each paragraph has to have its own main idea. It has to serve a certain purpose in your essay. And you also want the paragraphs to be in a logical order. So you can see that I wrote body paragraph 1, clean, renewable, cost-effective source of energy, and then body paragraph 2, aesthetics and location. So those are the topics that I'm trying to cover in that paragraph. You can do a quick little bullet point like that. It doesn't even have to be a complete sentence. It just helps you figure out what you're trying to prove. Now, one of the things that I like to do is include my evidence and commentary. Now, these are quick little bullet points here because in a timed situation, you probably won't have much time to do very thorough notes, but it can be helpful to start pulling your evidence. So you can see that I have some shorter quotes here, and I put the source next to it because you don't want to be digging through your packet trying to figure out which source a certain quote came from, and you don't want to be trying to find a certain quote as you're writing, especially if it's a time situation. So pulling these shorter quotes that you can easily embed into a sentence of your own really helps. Now, you still might need to go back to the source to just look at the context or maybe to pull some additional quotes, but this will give you an idea of the direction that you're going. And you'll notice that in the bullet points here, the bullet points start with some commentary verbs or power verbs like illustrates and demonstrates. So this tells you what you're trying to say about the evidence. Now, obviously, you're going to dig into this much more in an essay as opposed to these bullet points, but it does give you a hint of the evidence and commentary that you need. Now, one of the things that I noted for the second body paragraph is that I wanted to address the counter argument, and then I was going to offer a rebuttal. So that is an argumentative technique that you can use, and it's good to figure out where you want to actually include that in your essay, because it needs to be where it makes the most sense for your argument. Because of the magnitude of a synthesis essay, it is sort of like the beast of the AP Lang exam. So it can be really helpful to have an outline in advance. That way you can stay on track and make sure you're writing the most effective essay possible. So if you guys found this video helpful, I would love it if you would give the video a thumbs up. And until next time, guys, happy writing!